For this assignment, I chose to remediate Robert Browning's poem, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came. I had envisioned an epic MMO such as Lord of the Rings or World of Warcraft, with the player starting out as a young knight-errant on his first quest, not so unlike Roland himself, who is said to have wandered and traveled for years. I would have the players training and questing to gain experience and prepare for the final boss. This final boss I had imagined as a flaming denizen from the depths of hell summoned by the blowing of a horn. This image was inspired by his questioning of the horse being retired from Satan's stud in the last line of the poem with a slughorn. With all these ideas and pictures in my head, I had to ask myself, what part of the poem would I use to form a game? To decide this, I first had to answer several questions. I hope to be able to answer these questions for you, the viewer, and to give you an idea of what I had envisioned as a game through the screenshots that I used and my answers to the questions that I had asked myself. My first thought was, he lied, in every word, that hoary cripple with malice eye. A man of such hated mien, standing there to waylay travelers that cripple by the road. He would be a wonderful quest giver, staying there where anyone could, passing, would find him. Yet other things in the poem spoke to me for their need to be remediated. The stiff blind horse and the old friends mentioned. Could they not also play a part in this game? And finally the tower. How can you have a game based on the poem and yet leave out the tower? How could a game be complete without something for the players to tackle? Many adventure-style games use quests, side quests, mobs, and such, basically things to do so as to engage the player's interest and move the story along. To this end, I had envisioned Roland's friends, Cuthbert, Frank, and Giles, being as part of the game, having him meet them several times throughout the game, both as young adventurers and the old lost friends for quests, the free friends being both quest givers and helpers. My other thought was to add mini-games within the main game. By completing the challenges in these mini-games, the player could gain wealth, prestige, or some other tangible award. An example of mini-games would be something like the Battlegrounds of World of Warcraft or skirmishes in Lord of the Rings online. As for the gameplay, I would do both instances and zoning. Through the use of instances, I could tell the story of Childe Roland in a somewhat linear fashion. As the player's level increases, instance play would open up to them, telling them parts of his life. This way they can create their own story, yet they would know the lore behind the game. By having multiple zones, it would allow players to decide where they want to go play, and the player can play in an area that has the right content for their own level. This prevents them from being bored with it being too easy or frustrated from it being too hard. This has worked well for other games, so I would hate to challenge the success of this tactic, and as they work through the zones and instances, they would level and grow until they are ready for the final endgame boss. In those zones, I would have quests and tasks for them to complete. So, would I strive for realism, or would I allow for fantasy characters to be part of this world? Most of the games I've played, there are a lot of choices when it comes to character creation. In the poem, for example, there are several races that are mentioned. I use these to give me an idea of what races I might include and what could I do with them. For instance, take the idea of good versus evil. I could have evil giants and undead versus good elves and humans, or I could allow the player to determine if their character is good or evil depending on their play style and the use of their characters. I don't think the realism as a whole would work for this game, or at least not when it comes to race creations that the players could choose from, nor could they only have one class being an option. Most gamers I know like to have a selection of races to choose from, and the creation of group events would preclude the development of only one class. Classes being tanks, healers, or DPS. The same thing also applies that some players may want to play female or some male characters, so I would not be able to make just the male characters that were mentioned in the poem. The players would have to make choices when they start the game so as to have a character that they can identify with. Yet some realism would have to be in play, or it would feel too foreign and the players would not be able to connect with either the game or their own characters. Part of the remediation of this poem into a game setting would mean changing things to make them work. I would have to create an entire world leading up to the point where I could use this poem as part of the game. I would have to create an entire backstory for Roland alone. Other kinds of changes also needed would be making the content of the poem interactive. For example, taking the hills that are seen as giants in the poem and make them into actual giants that the players could fight. I would also have to expand the number of people mentioned in the poem to fill the needs of having NPCs in the game. and to account for the other players. Finally, I'd have to change some things about the most people who are not familiar with the workings of Browning into something that they could understand, such as the slug horn being the prime example, changing it into a horn that the players can use to bring out the final boss. So to remediate this poem into a game, I would have to pick out scenes such as the cripple, the horse in the tower, create dungeons and quests to challenge the players and keep them engaged in the content, and by using zones and instances, tell a story and keep the players moving towards the final boss, all the while letting them create a character that they can feel a connection with in a world that is a mixture of fantasy and realism, and by changing the poetic work into an interesting game content, yet keeping the essence of the story of Childe Roland intact. Thank you.